In this tutorial, let's take a look at a strategy we can use for fixing a render after we've already rendered the entire sequence, but we only want to fix a tiny part of it. We don't want to go back and have to re-render the whole thing. Now, there are different ways that we could do this. There are some more advanced techniques where we could use render layers, and that would involve compositing. But what if you're after kind of a quick and dirty fix that will basically solve the problem for you, kind of brute force it, and ultimately save you quite a bit of time? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this section, and that's what's going to be using filter maps within Arnold for Maya. So this is all based on Arnold. I have a scene in here that is constructed. It's our Star Wars diorama scene that I have available, and I am rendering it out from this particular viewpoint here. And just to give you a sense of what the render settings look like for this, just before I begin, in my render view, if I come in here, I'm just rendering it out as a TIFF sequence, making sure that I'm just doing a relatively short section here, only 56 frames. He's just sort of tossing the ball in the air, and some not really high settings for my sampling. Is just a little bit of a basic kind of setup here, just to give you a sense of the time you can save. So what do we get when we do this? If I were to render this out, I would go to render sequence and make sure that it's rendering out the correct camera, the render cam that I have set up for myself here. And if I do that, it will output all the images that I have here. Right, so you'll notice that the scene, the way that I have it set up, there is no background. There's an HDR dome that exists in the scene. That's that detail there you can see behind him, but that's not rendering out because specifically I have set this up when rendering this out so that if I click on the attribute editor for the dome and I come down into the dome settings here, within the visibility section, we can turn off its visibility when it renders. So setting that to 0 means that that won't render. Setting it to 1 means that it will render in the background. We don't want it to render. We just want a plain black background, and that way we can also get a nice alpha map for our character. Later on, if you wanted to, you could bring that back in as a separate background file, but for us, we're going to construct our own inside of After Effects. All right, so that's gone through. And if I take a look at this, how long did it take to render each of these out? Well, at these settings, it was roughly 20 seconds per image. So this didn't take a heck of a lot of time. Each of these, roughly 20 seconds. There's 56 of them. It took about 20 minutes in total to render through all of this. And we see our character throwing the ball up in the air like this. And that's what we would expect. Now, if you're doing a longer sequence, like a 10-second sequence, you have 240 frames. You're doing that at 20 seconds each, roughly, it's 4,800 frames. That's roughly 80 minutes. So an hour and 20 minutes, that's a decent amount of time. It's not super long for a render, but it's a decent amount of time, especially if you're on a deadline. And if you need to go back and fix something, you don't want to have to necessarily spend all that time re-rendering everything. It'd be better to just have to re-render the part that you want to fix, ultimately. If we were to go into After Effects here, for instance, let's just take a look at what I mean by that. So I'm going to import into this our sequence, make sure it comes in as a TIFF sequence. And let's go in and interpret this so that it's playing at the correct frame rate, so 24 frames per second. Drop that into our scene. And now, let's just make that a little bit more visible there. And as I play through here, just let that load into memory. Let's just pretend, for instance, that I have decided that I made a big oopsie here in the render. I missed something, and the big oopsie is that the ball that he's throwing there is the wrong color. I did not mean for it to have this texture. I meant for it to have some other texture. Okay, well, if I look at it, that ball does not take up much pixel space on the screen. Ultimately, it would be great if I did not have to re-render everything, take 20 seconds per frame to fix. I would rather just fix the ball. And as I mentioned before, we can do this with something called a filter map inside of Arnold. And what the filter map will do is it's basically a black and white image. Wherever it's black, it won't render any pixels. Wherever it's white, it will render those pixels. So if we could just create a white sort of mask around where this ball goes, we could really reduce the amount of time that is spent rendering out our fixed images ultimately. So you have to keep in mind a few things when you do this. Depending on the kinds of changes that you're making, will the texture change here have any impact on like the reflections in the scene? You know, if that's the case, then you may need to consider how big your affected area is. If you're changing the animation, for instance, you know, the character is now moving a little bit differently, how does that impact on the shadows? So these are all things that you'd kind of want to go in and test inside of Maya as well, just to see what the impact is between the before and the after, to get a sense of where those changes might impact. How much space do you actually need to render out? But if it's a small change like this, a pretty quick fix where you just want to change one thing, we can do it. And it's there's kind of like also another sort of philosophy in mind too. We could set up our scene to begin with where we only really focus on rendering out the part of the scene that's ever moving, right? So just our droid character here, because as you can see, it doesn't really have too much impact on the background there. The background's pretty much staying the same the whole time. So we could have set this up initially to only render out basically the region here with the droid moving, so long as he's not moving so much that the shadows will change over here. But we'll keep it really simple here for just our ball. To do this, what we will want to do is to create a mask. So we'll come up here to the rectangle tool. We're going to keep it really simple. I guess we could do it one of two ways. We could be really specific and just animate a mask that is just, you know, kind of the size of our little sphere here, and move that to match the sphere each time. But you know what? The amount of time that's going to take to do that is probably greater than the amount of time we will save by actually going in and just creating a basic mask from essentially where's the bottom of the trajectory. So something right about there. Let's start a mask there. Just start to draw it here. I know it's going to go up for a distance, so I'm just going to drag it up here a little bit. And so that's about the bottom there. And about the top. Okay, so it goes off the screen a little bit up the top there. So I can come in here, grab my selection tool, double click on our mask so I go into the free transform mode. And now let's just drag this mask up so we can see the top. We want to give ourselves a little bit of breathing room on either side here, so it's not right up against it. I'll show you why that's the case when we come back after looking at the results. Same thing is true for the bottom, making sure that it's not just super close to the bottom there. And then just checking the whole result. Does it all fit within here, within the entire animation? So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to create just a static image, static mask based on this, this one little section. However, if you wanted to, you could export out an entire sequence where this mask is being animated over time, and you can bring that image sequence into Maya as a filter map as well. But we're going to keep it simple in this case. So for this, we've created a mask here, but this is not really where we want to put it. We're going to create a couple, some basic layers here. So we're going to create a new solid. That solid will be just a black solid. Fine. And then we'll create on top of that a white solid. New solid white. Okay. But for that white solid, we are going to steal the mask that we just created here. So I'm just going to click on the mask, copy, paste, and now we have our black and white setup. That's just going to fit within that same region that we had outlined for our ball. And we only really need to render out just a single frame of this. So I'm going to frame 0 here, hit N, and that way it just kind of gives me one frame of my whole sequence here. Go ahead, add this to our render queue, and just making sure, confirming here that the duration is only 1 second long. That's fine. Changing our output format. I'm just going to change it to a TIFF sequence, and then giving it a name here. So if we go in and find our render directory here, this is just inside the images folder of my project. I'm probably not going to put it into the images folder. I'll put it into maybe my source images, and we'll just call this, we'll give it a new folder. We'll call it our filter map folder. So filter map. And go ahead, click inside that, rename it to K2S0 diorama underscore filter map. And then we'll just save that. Just click render, and it will be rendered instantly because it is just a single image that has come out now. Let's see there inside the filter map. There we go. Very good. And now just make sure that you don't lose what you've done here inside of After Effects. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and save this. You will need to get back exactly the same mask. I'll show you why. But for now, let's just click back here inside of Maya, and we want to apply this filter map, because let's just say that what we really want to do here is to change the material on our orb. Instead of having the color that is being provided to it by this current map, maybe we wanted to make a change to that color map that's being plugged in there, or maybe we decided we plugged the wrong thing in altogether, and we just want it to be this very vibrant fuchsia kind of color here. So, if we look at this when it renders, it's going to be very obviously, strikingly different than what we had before. That'll be good for our purposes. It won't look very nice in the reality, but it will be good for the purposes of just learning. And now what we can do is come back and find our camera. This is our render cam here. I'll click on the render camera selection so that we can scroll down and find the options for Arnold associated with this. Most objects inside of Maya, if you're running Arnold, will have an Arnold tab specific so that you can actually update the some part of the scene based on the Arnold rendering system. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete whatever I had in there originally. Normally it won't have anything in there. So we're just going to go in and say, hey, we want to apply a filter map here. Click on my little checkered box, and I'm going to go in. I want to find one of the 2D textures. My 2D texture is just a file node. Click on that, and here's where I'm going to load in the filter map. So double click on the filter map, click on just that first image there. If you had multiple images and it's an image sequence, then you'd click on use image sequence. But in this case, we only have a single one. So we don't need to worry about that. Just make sure that if you are using an image sequence, that you are exporting out the image sequence at the same frame rate as whatever your project settings are inside of Maya. Okay, with that done now, let's take a look at the result that we get. So if we come back over here and click render, I'm just going to make sure render cam, it'll go through, and it is now rendering just this region right here instead of rendering the entire image. You'll see that it did kind of go through and go through each of these pixels here. It did take a little moment to do that, but these are fairly quick, and the total time spent on this was just 2 seconds instead of 20 seconds for the entire image. So with that in place, what we can do now is let's go through and do a render sequence on this entire settings. But as we do this, making sure that we have the exact same render settings as we were using before, the one thing we're going to update is to change the name. So we'll call this now K2SO diorama, probably not filter map, but we'll call it, maybe call it filter mapped or filtered or re-rendered, something like that. And everything else needs to stay exactly the same for it to have to be consistent in terms of the image quality. All right, so with that in place, now we'll go up here, go to render sequence, and render sequence and close. I'm going to pause the video while it does this, but it's going to go through and spit these out pretty darn quickly. In fact, I can show you over here as we're going through, it pops into the images folder, and you can see that they're just popping out here really fast. I'm going to pause while it keeps doing this. All right, it's finished that now. It took about roughly 2.5 minutes. So remember, it took 20 minutes or so to render out all of the originals, and now it took roughly 2.5 minutes to render out just the fix. So that's a big savings in time in case we needed to go back and re-render the entire sequence for some reason. This is just 56 frames. It would be a much more significant difference in time if you were in savings in time if you had a longer sequence to render out. So let's take this solution inside of After Effects now. And if we import that in here, pop down here, grab the first one, TIFF sequence, and make sure that it is coming in as a 24 frame per second sequence. Okay, so we can just pop that right on top of our scene here. All right, so we have, at the moment, we have a mask, remember, that is sitting right here. This is, if I turn it off, I can just say none, right? That mask will be disabled there. And with this, sorry, kind of get stuck here with my my selection tools. But what we are seeing here, which is a little bit odd, escape. There we go. Finally got rid of it. What we're seeing here right now is that there's actually a bit of a black outline around this. And in fact, I've created a light gray solid here just to kind of see where does that outline exist. It's basically just, it appears to be just where the part here overlaps the character. So that's interesting. I'm going to make sure that my whole thing is set up to render the entire sequence again. So you can see here, just checking to make sure that everything rendered properly. It did, so that's great. But what about this little section here? Because that's not wonderful. That's an easy fix, fortunately. So our character, remember, has a mask around it. This mask here, we can just say add is fine. But what we can do, though, is to play around with this expansion a bit. So if we take in its expansion, we can probably delete some of its impact. But we need to make sure to do that not on our original layer, but on the re-render layer. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this mask. I'm going to cut it, so Control X. And I'm going to paste it here onto the layer that we just created. So here you can see that it's masking out this section, so we don't want to invert it. We want to keep it as it is. And now, oops, didn't want to click on that. Now, if I sort of pop around here real quick, I always find this somewhat frustrating in the way that things get selected inside of After Effects. We want to take this mask and change the expansion. So right now, if I just go down to -1 pixels, there we go. You can see that that's actually gotten rid of it because that little mask around there was just about 1 pixel in width. And if you are concerned, you could take it down just down to 2, right? There we go. That's why I said make sure you have enough room around your mask so it's not right up against the object that you're trying to mask out. So now as we watch this here, you can see that if I just let it play in, you can see that the whole thing is playing. We've swapped out our one change here, and it's working quite well. So now what you could do is you could of course export this out using it as by adding it to the render queue, saving out your sequence. I have here, a background that I added in. This is something that I would play around with, like finding a good colored background for it, playing around with some of the vignetting on it, and coming up with a good solution. But for now, this one was just kind of giving me a little bit of a sense of the overall color and where the mask was sitting. So that pretty much is the overall idea of using a filter map. It's a nice little extra thing to have in your tool belt to save time when you need it. as I did say, there are other more advanced ways that you can solve these issues, but they are going to require a more advanced understanding of compositing. This is kind of the real basic, quick and dirty version of how to fix something, and I like it because sometimes it's easier to just create a map around or a mask around a certain area, especially if that area has a lot of different objects on it, than it is to try to figure out how to combine each of those objects into an appropriate um, region or an appropriate render layer inside of Maya. So good luck. Hope this is of use to you, and enjoy.